A man is found dead at dawn. Skull caved in, blood already dark and stiff in the dirt. No sirens. No detectives showing up with notepads. No courtroom waiting somewhere down the line. Just 40 people standing in a circle around a body, and one question nobody wants to say out loud. Who did this, and what happens now? This isn't a hypothetical. This happened. Over and over, for hundreds of thousands of years, in every single human group that ever existed, before writing, before cities, before the idea of the law was even a sentence anyone could form. And here's the part that should stop you cold. These people had no police, no prisons, no judges. And yet they solved this consistently. Across completely disconnected cultures on different continents that never once made contact with each other, they landed on strikingly similar answers. You'd assume it was chaos. Revenge killings spiraling into war, or grief just swallowed whole because there was nothing anyone could do about it. The real answer is stranger than that, and honestly, a little more disturbing. Because the system they built didn't run on courts. It ran on people. Ordinary people who had to look a killer in the eye and decide, together, whether he lived. Let's go back to the body in the dirt. Her name, for our purposes, was Senna, and she was the closest thing her band had to an elder, not a chief. Small hunter-gatherer groups mostly didn't have those. Just someone people listened to when things got hard, because she'd survived longer and buried more people than almost anyone else standing there. Her band numbered around 30. That number matters more than you'd think. Anthropologists studying groups like this, nomadic, foraging, moving with the seasons, put the typical size somewhere between 20 and 50 people. Small enough that everyone knew everyone. Small enough that losing even one person, for any reason, was a wound the whole group felt in its food supply, its defense, its ability to carry the next injured hunter home. So when Senna looked down at the body of a young man named Taven, she wasn't just looking at a death. She was looking at a hole that had just been torn in the only safety net any of these people had. And standing a few feet away, refusing to meet anyone's eyes, was Doran, a hunter Senna had known since he was a boy. Everyone already knew what everyone else was thinking. Doran did this. Over a woman, over an insult, over something that had been simmering for a season. It didn't matter which. What mattered was what came next. Because here's the thing, modern people almost never think about. There was no rule book for this. No inherited legal code passed down from a government that didn't exist yet. Whatever happened next, this group of 30 had to invent it, together, right there, in real time. And the terrifying part is that they had to get it right. Get it wrong, and you either lose a second person to revenge, or you lose the whole group to fear and distrust that eats away at cooperation until nobody can hunt together anymore. This is where it gets genuinely strange. Because when researchers went looking, actually looking, across dozens of small-scale societies on different continents, they didn't find chaos. They found something closer to a pattern. A closed loop of options that keeps showing up again and again, like it's wired into something deeper than culture. The anthropologist Christopher Boehm spent decades studying this exact question. He surveyed dozens of foraging and small-scale societies, cross-continental, culturally unconnected, looking specifically at how groups without formal authority handled someone who became genuinely dangerous to the community. What he found was not lawlessness. It was something he came to describe as a kind of moral democracy enforced through group consensus, where the community itself acted as judge, jury, and, when it came to it, executioner. No single person held that power. The group did. Together. Let that sit with you for a second. These weren't isolated incidents of mob violence. This was closer to a functioning legal system, just one that lived entirely inside the relationships between people instead of inside a courthouse. And it wasn't always execution. That's the part people assume first, and it's wrong more often than it's right. Sit with the real range of what these bands actually did, because it's more layered than kill or forgive. Take the Jew/Honzi, a foraging people of the Kalahari Desert in southern Africa. The anthropologist Richard Lee spent years living among them, and during his fieldwork, he pieced together, through interviews with people who remembered it, one of the only documented cases of a planned, group-sanctioned execution in what outsiders had long assumed was one of the most peaceful societies on Earth. A man had killed more than once, not in a single fit of rage, repeatedly, over time, until the group could no longer pretend he was safe to live among. And when the moment came, it wasn't one furious relative acting alone. Several men, acting together with what amounted to the community's blessing, ended it. Together. On purpose. As a group. That word, together, is going to keep coming back. Hold on to it. Now go north, to the Arctic, to Inuit communities studied by legal anthropologist E. Adamson Hobel and documented through the accounts of explorers like Knud Rasmussen, and you find something almost the opposite. A conflict resolution ritual that looks, on the surface, nothing like justice at all. Two men with a grievance between them. Sometimes something as serious as a killing would face off in front of the entire community and take turns hurling insults at each other. In song. Composed, performed, rhythmic insults, judged by the crowd on wit and delivery as much as content. It's called a song duel, and it sounds almost comedic until you understand what it was actually doing. In a landscape where physical violence could easily spiral into a group losing hunters it couldn't afford to lose, this was a pressure valve, a way to let humiliation do the work that a knife would otherwise do. The loser lost status. Sometimes that was the whole punishment. But, and this is the part that gets left out of the cheerful version of that story, song duels weren't a substitute for everything. When a man in these same Arctic communities became a repeat killer, someone the group genuinely feared, the record shows something colder. A quiet consensus would form. And a relative, or a group of men acting with the tacit agreement of the community, would kill him. Not in anger. In resolution. There was no trial in the way you'd picture one. There was something more chilling. An agreement that formed slowly, silently, among people who'd simply had enough. Then there's the Nuer, a cattle-herding people of what's now South Sudan, studied extensively by the anthropologist E. Evans Pritchard in the 1930s. Their system was built almost entirely around avoiding execution, because they understood something the other groups understood too. Kill the killer, and now his family wants revenge, and now you have 2 deaths, then 4, then a feud that outlives everyone currently alive to remember how it started. So instead, a killer would flee to the homestead of a man called a leopard skin chief. Not a political ruler, more like a sacred mediator, someone whose home functioned as neutral ground where blood couldn't be spilled. And there, over time, sometimes months, the chief would negotiate compensation. Cattle. Dozens of them, paid from the killer's family to the victim's family. Not because cattle equal a human life. Nobody believed that. But because the exchange forced both families back into a relationship instead of a war. It rebuilt the connection the killing had severed. 3 completely different groups. 3 completely different climates, languages, economies. And underneath all of it, the same 3 tools, used over and over across human history. Execution by consensus, ritualized humiliation to diffuse violence before it escalates, and negotiated compensation that repairs the relationship instead of ending another life. Here's the counterintuitive truth, though, the one that actually surprised the researchers who spent their careers on this. Execution, in most of these societies, was rare. Genuinely rare. Not because these people were softer than we assume, but because they had a punishment that was, in practical terms, far more brutal than death, and it barely looks like punishment at all from the outside. Banishment. Kick someone out. That's it. No violence required. No blood on anyone's hands. Just tell a person, you no longer belong here, and walk away. Now picture what that actually meant for a person alive 20, 40, 80,000 years ago. No agriculture. No stored food, no other settlement, 2 miles down a paved road you could just walk to. A single human being, alone, an open landscape, with no group to share a kill, no one to watch their back while they slept, no one to carry them if they broke a leg chasing an antelope across broken ground. Survival at that point in human history depended almost entirely on cooperation. Take away the group, and you haven't just punished someone. You've handed them a slow, statistically near certain death sentence, and you've done it without anyone having to swing a weapon. That's the twist nobody sees coming. The quietest punishment was the deadliest one. Exile wasn't the merciful alternative to execution. In the world these people actually lived in, it very often was execution, just stretched out over weeks instead of seconds, and dressed up so nobody in the group had to carry the weight of having killed anyone with their own hands. And that detail, no one having to carry the weight alone, shows up again and again once you start looking for it, and it's genuinely uncomfortable once you notice the pattern. In the Jew/Honzi case, it wasn't one man who delivered the killing blow. It was several, acting together at the same moment. Some accounts of collective punishment in small-scale societies describe entire groups participating symbolically, even if only a few hands actually did the physical work. Throwing a stone, holding a limb, standing in agreement while it happened. Spread the act across enough people, and no single person has to live with being the one who killed a member of their own tribe. Everyone is a little bit responsible, which means, psychologically, almost no one is. If that sounds familiar, it should. Centuries later, firing squads used the exact same trick. One rifle in the line loaded with a blank, so that no single soldier could ever be completely certain it was his shot that killed the man in front of him. Same mechanism. Same ancient need to diffuse guilt across a group, so it doesn't crush any one person. We didn't invent that idea in a military manual. We inherited it from bands of 30 people standing around a body in the dirt, figuring out how to survive their own worst moment without falling apart. And this is where it stops being ancient history and starts being uncomfortably close to home. Because you still run on this exact same wiring. Ever notice how much easier it is to feel angry in a crowd than alone? Pile-ons online, where 100 strangers pile criticism onto one person, and no single commenter feels like they did anything that bad. That's diffusion of responsibility, the same mechanism that let a Kalahari community end a threat without any one man carrying the full guilt of it. Ever wonder why a jury is 12 people instead of one judge deciding alone? That's consensus-based justice, dressed up in a courtroom, doing the same job Senna's circle of 30 was doing under open sky. And ostracism. Being frozen out of a friend group, a workplace, a family. Activates the same regions of the brain as physical pain, according to modern neuroscience research on social rejection. Your body still reacts to being cut off from the group like it's a survival-level threat. Because for most of human history, it was. We like to imagine that ancient people without laws were either brutal savages or peaceful innocents. One extreme or the other. Neither one is true. What they actually built was something closer to a working legal system, run entirely through relationships instead of institutions. Slower, messier, and in some ways far more psychologically sophisticated than anything we've replaced it with, because it had to be. There was no backup, no appeals process. Just people, forced to look directly at what they were doing to each other and to live inside the consequences of it together. Back to Senna, standing over Tavin's body, with Doran refusing to look up. There was no vote taken with raised hands. Nothing that clean. It was slower than that. Days of quiet conversations, some in whispers, some not so quiet. Arguments about what Doran owed and what the group could survive losing. Senna listened more than she spoke. In the end, the decision wasn't death. It was exile. Doran was given what food he could carry and told, in front of everyone, that he no longer belonged. No chains, no violence. Just a line drawn in the sand between him and the only thing that had ever kept him alive. Other people. He walked out of camp under a wide, empty sky, and the group he had spent his whole life inside of simply watched him go and did not follow. Nobody knows, of course, whether a man like Doran survived out there. Statistically, in that world, the odds were never in his favor. But that was never really the point. The point was that 30 people had just faced the hardest decision a group without laws will ever face, and they'd made it without a single blade drawn. They didn't need a courtroom. They just needed each other, and the terrible, quiet understanding of exactly what it costs to lose that. If a story like this got under your skin even a little, imagine what it took to actually live it.